On today's episode, we discuss the idea of the Dallas Stars trading for defenseman Brett Pesce. We talk about why he would want out of Carolina, what potential trade packages could look like, what the Stars could send back to the Hurricanes in exchange for Pesce, and where he would fit best in the lineup if he were to become a Star. All of this coming up on today's episode of the Locked On Stars podcast.
Your Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Howdy, Stars fans. Welcome back to the Locked On Stars podcast, the only daily podcast covering the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Dane Lewis, your local expert on all things Dallas Stars hockey, coming to you on this Wednesday, July 19th. And this episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more and visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And whether this is your first time here or you are a recurring listener, thank you for stopping by and making Locked On Stars your first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe to the show on YouTube. Follow along on your favorite podcasting platform of choice. We are always free and available no matter where or how you choose to listen. And remember that we are now on a 3-episode per week schedule, uploading Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays until the start of training camp. But even though it seems like most of the big moves are done this offseason, I caught some wind and read a recent article that has my mind stirring yet again about a potential trade for the Dallas Stars. I was going to talk about the defensive lineup and my way too early predictions for the defensive pairings, but we'll probably push that to Friday because of this discussion. There was an interesting article posted recently on The Athletic by Shania Goldman talking about Hurricanes defenseman Brett Pesce. Pesce is going into the final year of his contract, and while it appears that the Carolina Hurricanes are interested in keeping Pesce long-term, or at least somewhat long-term, there's also some speculation that he could be on the move, and it certainly seems like there could be a chance that they might not come to an agreement on a contract extension. And so, of course, they wouldn't want to go and lose a guy like Brett Pesce for nothing by letting him play this season and then letting him walk as an unrestricted free agent in the 2024 offseason. You would not want to do that for a guy who has provided some pretty great value for the Hurricanes over the past handful of seasons. Pesce was taken in the 3rd round of the 2013 NHL draft by the Hurricanes, a draft that I think the Hurricanes only had like 4 or 5 picks in that draft in 2013, and it was Brett Pesce and Elias Lindholm that were taken in that draft. Lindholm, of course, taken in the 1st round, and then Pesce taken in the 3rd, and he's built himself a very respectable NHL career in Carolina, recording 36 goals, 149 assists, 185 points, and 557 NHL games played, as well as 55 playoff games with 20 points, 5 of those being goals. But this is a defenseman who certainly would demand a pretty decent amount of value in a trade. Not the most electrifying D-man in the NHL, but certainly one that almost every NHL roster or every NHL team and GM would be interested in having on their team for a nightly basis. Pesce has great size at 6'3", 206 pounds, but doesn't necessarily always let that physical side be on full display. He's a little bit pick and choose when it comes to, big hits and things of that nature, which might be for the best given that he's starting to climb in age just a little bit, 28 years old. So certainly still plenty left to give to the sport of hockey, but especially a position like defenseman, as demanding as that position can be, you certainly want to be conservative with the way that you use your body and be economical in the use of your skills. He's not going to wow you, Pesce in this case. He's not going to wow you with his point totals or his goals, but he can absolutely hold his own as a full-time NHL defenseman, especially next to a team's number one guy. He can slot in just about anywhere in a team's top four. And while he might re-sign in Carolina, Goldman did mention in the article that the Hurricanes historically don't hand out very hefty or large contracts unless it's for a true superstar or game changer, a Sebastian Aho, Andrei Svechnikov, Slavin, so on and so forth. I feel like those players are likely warranting some pretty big money from the Hurricanes, but those are superstar, cornerstone, franchise-altering players that you want to structure the rest of your team around. And while Brett Pesce is certainly a good NHL player, a respectable NHL player, he's not a guy that you build your team around, especially on the defensive front. You'd much rather have a Jacob Slavin or even a Brent Burns, even though Brent Burns is starting to get up there in age. You look at Brent Burns in his prime, you certainly would not mind building your team defensively around a player like Brent Burns. But I think that this opens the door for many teams to look to acquire Brett Pesce sometime this offseason before training camp to add some quality depth to their blue line. And likely whichever team goes after him would be looking to give him the extension that he so desires, looking to make more in his next contract than he was making previously. Or I guess not really previously, as he's still under the contract. It's worth just over $4 million, $4.025 million, currently taking up 4.8% of the Hurricanes cap space. And again, being 28 years old, being a defenseman, this could be the last window for Pesce to go out and get a relatively big and large contract before he probably starts signing some shorter deals between the range of 1 or 3 years near the back end of his career, should he choose to play beyond whatever this next one could look like for him. But amongst all of the teams that were mentioned in this article by Goldman, the Dallas Stars were amongst that group. They were actually the first team listed in the article, as I feel like has been the case for the most part with most defensemen on the market this offseason, whether they be free agents or trade targets. And I think it could make sense that Pesce could be on his way out, because as much as Carolina can say, oh, we'd love to keep Brett Pesce, and I'm sure part of them would, you can see that they've started to somewhat move on and restructure that defensive room. Of course, Jacob Slavin is coming back. Brent Burns is coming back. But this offseason, they added Dmitry Orlov to that blue line to a pretty hefty deal. I say that they don't hand out those hefty deals, but boy, did they hand out a big check for Dmitry Orlov, a 2-year deal, $7.75 million AAV over the course of those 2 seasons. So I feel like if, they are pretty sparing with those contracts in some ways, you would imagine that Brett Pesce, he's probably not worth that much money, but he's certainly not going to be getting a substantial pay grade or upgrade in pay from the Hurricanes. At least that's what I'm able to gather just by looking at the current situation and state of the Hurricanes at this time. But it's not as easy as just saying he's going to get traded. Dallas needs a defenseman. Let's make it happen. There's a lot more that goes into it. And as of right now, it seems that the Dallas Stars might not be in the best position to make a trade of this magnitude. Could they make it work? Would it be worth trying to make it work? We will discuss that coming up next. Today's episode of Locked On Stars is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $2,000. That's right, just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend on betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run of a respective game. All on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And there's no better time to be betting on the MLB. The division races are starting to heat up in the second half of the season. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel is an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. I want to thank you again for making Locked On Stars your first listen of the day. The YouTube audience might have noticed I forgot my nifty little frame here, but we have everything back up and running for the remainder of the episode, continuing to discuss the idea of defenseman Brett Pesce coming to the Dallas Stars. But of course, with any trade talk, rumor, speculation, you have to take everything into account. It's not as simple as, whoa, I think this guy's a pretty good player and he would fit pretty well alongside X, Y, or Z player for that current franchise, which we will dive into the final segment, where Pesci would potentially fit, who he should play with if he does get traded to Dallas. We'll discuss that in the final segment of the episode, but let's flip the script. Typically with these, I say where he'd fit, all of the good benefits of adding this player, and then I hit you with the, well, it'd be really hard to make this trade because of cap space, or he's an injury-prone player, or he wouldn't fit with the team. And only some of those apply in this situation. But as really any case with any Dallas Stars move from here on out, the cap situation must be taken into account. But also there's a few other little red flags here and there. Pesci does have a tendency at times to be a little bit injury prone. Over recent years, it hasn't been really anything too severe, but most players in this sport tend to be injury prone. It's a violent sport, but Pesci did play the entirety of the 23-24 season. He played all 82 regular season games and only missed 12 games back in the 21-22 season. And as mentioned earlier, Pesci is not a guy who is going to blow you away with offensive numbers. However, I do think maybe that there could be a small, a minuscule boost in some numbers if he's entered into the Stars system. However, I think that, his flaws offensively could be worked around and could be complemented if placed with the right partner on his defensive pairing, where you aren't necessarily expecting a player like Pesci to carry the load offensively, at least from the blue line, when he's on the ice. But again, we will discuss that later in the episode. The biggest problem, as I mentioned, and as you know, if you've been following this team and if you're aware of the cap situation, it's the money. And that's the problem with the NHL across the board a lot of times with moves like this, is trying to make the money work. Again, Brett Pesce carries a $4.025 million cap hit, which isn't a boatload of money. There's certainly more expensive players out there, players that cost more and maybe don't provide as much value. I think that this is pretty fair compensation for the type of player that Brett Pesce is and has been over the past handful of seasons for this Carolina Hurricanes organization. And I think maybe somewhere in that range, but if not a little bit more, I think would be fair compensation for what he could provide to whatever team he plays for next. And again, I understand that he's wanting to maybe get a little bit of a pay raise, as this could be his last potential large contract or relatively large contract. But the Stars themselves don't necessarily have a ton of cap space to work with. They quite literally have zero cap space to work with, or negative cap space to work with the minus 317,000 projected cap space on Cap Friendly. But there will be some moves made once the season begins, with moves to the AHL or, scratches and things like that. Really moving players down to the minor leagues who are currently on the books for the NHL club. That will resolve some issues, but they still would be nowhere near in the ballpark to get Brett Pesce with the cap space that they would have available. But there could be some NHL players that could get sent off either to Carolina or elsewhere in order to dump off that cap in a potential trade. And it's likely going to be just with the Hurricanes. They would likely be seeking some NHL-ready talent, as they are in a similar window as the Dallas Stars, a contending window, the counterpart to the Stars in the Eastern Conference, having made it to the conference finals, although things did not go as swimmingly for them as it did the Stars, although I guess it didn't really go swimmingly for either team, as they both ended up watching the Cup final from home. However, the Hurricanes, they're different than some of the other teams that we've discussed this offseason of the Stars potentially trading with or making a deal with. A lot of these other teams I've mentioned are teams that are lottery teams or teams that are not ready to compete for deep playoff runs, but the Hurricanes are I think almost in the exact same spot of a timeline as the Stars is. I don't think it's a fluke that they made it to the conference final. I think they'll be a good team next year, and they're set up to be pretty good, I think, for the next handful of seasons, similar to the Dallas Stars. The question is, if you're Dallas, which NHL players are you willing to part ways with of the options that you have to trade, and which players that have no move clauses or no trade clauses could you even move with those speed bumps in their contracts that could make them a little more difficult to move. And you also have to assess what personnel the Canes are in need of. And I kind of went through the defensive group, the blue line for them. It's a pretty solid group, even if they lose Pesci, especially with their top 3 paid defensemen and Orlov, Slavin, and Burns. That's a very solid group, but you're probably still sending some form of defenseman back to that team. And ironically, I think the best option for the Stars would be Yanni Hakanpää, because there is no entanglement in his contract. There's not a no trade clause or a no move clause. You could simply trade Yanni Hakanpää and get rid of that $1.5 million cap hit, whereas moving a guy like Ryan Suter or Esa Lindell would not be as easy because of no move clauses built into their contracts. But Yanni Hakanpää, I think, could go back, which is ironic because that's where he played before coming to Dallas, if I'm not mistaken. But there probably could be a forward sent in the deal as well. A Radek Faksa, perhaps a Mason Marchment. I think, a move like that, some sort of mixture combination of those moves could potentially, seal the deal for Carolina, as well as likely a first-round draft pick, which I think the Stars would be willing to part ways with, as they do currently have their first-round pick for the 2024 draft. But if their season goes according to plan and it ends the way that they would like it to, that pick probably won't be worth a ton, as it will probably be coming in the final 4 picks or so of the first round. So you always do like to have those draft picks in your back pocket at times, but I don't think the Stars would be too upset if they gave up a first round pick in 2024, if it meant adding a defenseman who could help contribute to the championship efforts at this current juncture of where the franchise and organization is at. So those are some of the pieces that I think, and players that I think could be on the move for the Stars if they so choose to pursue Brett Pesce for their organization. I think he'd be a pretty good fit. I think that he would complement one player in particular very well. And we'll dive into that and where he would fit in the defensive group coming up next. Third and final segment of today's episode of Locked On Stars. Brett Pesce, potentially on the move out of Carolina. The Dallas Stars seemingly would probably be interested, or at least look into acquiring Pesce if he were available via trade. It's not really a mystery that he would easily squeeze into the Stars' top 4 if he were traded here. Now, the question that has to be asked is, where would he fit best? And many Stars fans would rejoice, as Brett Pesce is a right-handed defenseman. And I know that this Stars organization is littered with left-handed defensemen, or guys that are considered both because they're having to play on their non-dominant side the majority of the time, i.e. Miro Heiskanen. But I think that a guy like Pesce would complement Miro Heiskanen very, very well. Putting Pesce and Heiskanen together would allow Miro to go back to his natural side on the left and allow Pesce to play on his dominant side on the right. And then you're able to bump Ryan Suter down either to the second or third pair. More on that later this week when we discuss the idea, or the idea of a way too early defensive roster projection. But I think Pesce and Heiskanen would be a sneaky underrated pair on the blue line for the Dallas Stars. I think he is best utilized when he can be a little bit more of a support beam for a more skilled defenseman. That's not to say Brett Pesce doesn't have skills. There are certain things that he brings to the table that make him a good player, that have allowed him to have such a long career despite being a third-round pick. As I said, he's built a very good career for himself. And even without the flashy numbers or the huge stat lines, he's still one of the more consistent players for the Hurricanes over the past handful of seasons. And I think he could be that for the Dallas Stars too. And I think that he could complement Heiskanen very well, where Heiskanen is taking over the game offensively, doing a little bit more of the shooting. But then you have Pesce there, who can hold his own offensively and especially defensively, helping set things up for Heiskanen, set the table for him, or at least help mediate things up at the top of the offensive zone. And I think that they would mix very, very well together. And it really allows Heiskanen to be the fullest version of himself, as again, he would be getting to play on his dominant side, shooting left-handed. And just at the end of the day, it seems like a grand slam of an idea if you can make the trade work without having to give up too much. Adding Pesci would just be a win-win for him and for the organization, as the Stars would be adding a guy who knows what it's like to be in a competitive locker room, in a competitive organization that's been having some success as of late. The Carolina Hurricanes are in a good spot as an organization. They seem to be run very well. They've had a lot of on-ice success over the past handful of seasons. And like I said, I think they're poised, similar to the Stars, to have even more success in the future. And of course, the Stars as a team would benefit from having him in the room, and he gets to be in a room that is filled with other veterans and guys that are wanting to win the Stanley Cup, as Brett Pesce also does not have a cup in his career. And you just know for a fact that he would love nothing more than to help chip in the effort to bringing the cup back to Dallas. I think that he would be an excellent fit alongside Miro Heiskanen. And then you mix that in with some of the other great talent dispersed throughout the group. Thomas Harley, Niels Lundqvist, even Esa Lindell somewhere in there as well. It could be a pretty good defensive group, still with some flaws, as every team does tend to have in their lineup. But I think it would be a massive improvement if you're able to add Brett Pesce to the top four of the Dallas Stars defensive core. But that is going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Stars. Be sure to let me know if you're watching on YouTube. Hop in the comment section down below and let me know your thoughts on Brett Pesce as a player. Do you have any impressions from watching him play against the Stars or just in the NHL over the handful of years that he's been in the league? Do you think he'd be a good fit? Would you want to see the Stars go after him? And what do you think the Stars should give up in return should they choose to make the trade? Let me know in the comment section down below. Thank you again for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day. Subscribe to the show on YouTube. Follow on your favorite podcasting platform of choice. Remember, we are always free and available no matter where or how you choose to listen. We will be back here on Friday, likely with the way too early projections for the defensive core, unless there is some breaking news that we need to discuss. That is the plan as of this recording. So I hope you guys enjoy your Wednesday, and we will see you back here for the final episode of the week on Friday.